Welcome to Next in Tech, an S&P Global Market Intelligence podcast where the world of emerging tech lives. I'm your host, Eric Hanselman, Chief Analyst for Industry and Company Data at S&P Global Market Intelligence. And today, we're going to be talking about data migration. It's a topic that is suddenly much more important when we start thinking about a lot of applications that are dealing with large volumes of data, and especially things like AI. And with me to discuss it is Henry Baltazar. Henry, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Eric.
It is great to have you back. And I know our listeners may have heard Dan Kennedy talk about getting some sort of maybe a jacket or something to commemorate those that have been repeat guests. If we were doing something like that, you would definitely be in line for some good swag. So I think I've got to get on the program and figure out what we're going to do to honor some of our repeat guests. But it's great to have you back, especially when we start thinking about some of the metrics that you've been seeing as a result of a recent study on data migration. What are you seeing, and what's your take?
Yeah, I think at a high level, the main take for me is I think this is the year where data migration really gets real. It's not that we haven't been doing data migration. I mean, we've been doing data migration for dozens of years. But what's interesting about it is how important this has become, especially as we try to move to more hybrid and multi-cloud type architectures going forward.
Well, this is sort of one of the questions that I think we've had, and that AI has really shown a really bright light on. You know, we've always had issues with data. We've always had issues with sorting out where organizations are actually doing the real application work that's driving, core business capabilities. But now we're getting to a point at which, with AI, the data volumes are large enough that it's starting to make a difference. And this has been, it's been one of the challenges with overall use of, especially, it's getting into hybrid worlds. We've been able to run hybrid applications in pretty, I'll say not necessarily high performance, but in a lot of sort of disaggregated ways, and in that we had chunks of applications in clouds, but they were all pretty standalone. And we were only really just starting to stress some of the issues in terms of performant data movement between on-prem and cloud, between cloud environments. Where we weren't moving large volumes of data, it was something that we'd kind of work our way around. Now, as we start getting into AI applications that are consuming significantly larger volumes of data, suddenly a lot of the things that we did in what has become the hybrid world we live in are suddenly hitting the walls of performance and even existential issues of you just can't do it that way.
Yeah, definitely, especially use cases like AI, but even other use cases that aren't AI. Maybe it's video surveillance, maybe it's healthcare imaging. When you start dealing with these large unstructured data files, that's going to make the burden of data migration become bigger and bigger. And one of the things that really alarmed me when I looked at the study, one of the data points I saw that year over year was a big change was the percentage of respondents that claim that they've moved over a petabyte of data. To me, a petabyte of data, that's a lot of data. For most people, that's going to take a while to move that over from on-premises to cloud or back if you're doing a repatriation. But in our numbers, a year ago, only about 40% said that they had moved the data set that was over a petabyte to or from the cloud. This year, that's jumped up to 70%, 30% jump of respondents that have done that. That to me shows, okay, it's getting real because now the majority of respondents have had experience moving a big data set to or from the cloud, which is definitely something we should care about. I think another thing that was kind of interesting as well was, as you were alluding to, that movement between clouds has been interesting as well, especially as people want to become more multi-cloud. They want to be able to access technology or resources between different clouds. Maybe cloud A has a new algorithm that cloud B doesn't have. Well, I better move my data to cloud A so I could use that. In our study, that also jumped from 40% who have had experience doing that cloud to cloud migration, jumped all the way up to 78% actually in the latest numbers. So an even higher jump in regards to there. So when I start looking at these things, these are really the clear signs to me that these are becoming real, because more of the respondents are claiming, or they're validating that they're moving bigger data sets and they're moving things between cloud. Yeah, obviously there's also some people doing repatriation as well, but those things are also being determined by other factors like compliance and sovereignty and other things like that, which are driving repatriation.
Oh, well, you talk about some of the big motivations for moving it, but I think the interesting piece is also the fact that we're starting to hit significantly higher levels of data in a lot of non-AI applications. You mentioned video surveillance, certainly digital imaging for healthcare. Those are areas that we've seen massive growth in storage consumption as well. And again, if we're starting to do more with that data, we've now compounded the need to be able to pull this data together, because we've now, even if we're just trying to move and manage and work on that data, we've got a large volume. And if on top of that, we're trying to apply analytics, we're trying to do something more sophisticated to it, we've got to get the data to where the analytical capabilities are. And that makes life a little more complicated.
Yeah, and again, I'm going to be the cheerleader for data migration and why it's important. When we look at our numbers, 78% agreed, either to a strong level or even to a partial level, that they have the sentiment that the reason why they're doing data migration is for cost savings. I think the other reason why we're doing this, or the reason why you need to be your organization has to be really good at data migration, is there's also the possibility you might make a mistake. And we actually did see that in some of the customer calls. So for example, we had a customer call with a Midwest medium-sized healthcare organization. And like many organizations, their CTO came in and said, hey, you know what? We're going to start doing consolidation. Take all that data from your on-premises centers and put it in the cloud. That's what we're doing. They did that. And then guess what? Next year, they implemented a high-resolution video capability for their operations. Instantly broke all the things that they had done on the consolidation level because the latency was so bad. And they basically had to unpeel all that consolidation and bring those data sets back to their respective hospitals because the latency was too much and they couldn't get the workload running correctly. So to me, it's good insurance because not only are you going to use the data migration to do whatever you need to do, but the fact is use cases change, costs change, compliance changes, governance changes, all those things. All those changes that could happen could force you to make a move more quickly than you anticipated. And when you have to fix something, that winds up being a case where let's go back to data migration and make sure this data is residing in the place that we feel most comfortable for it to be residing.
Well, because it's the thing that I keep harping on. It's one of those things that, and I will beg the patience of our listeners who've heard this before. People have talked for a long time about data being the new oil, and I'll make the case that it's oil's a bad example because it's not. Something like oil, you're using it up. It's the fuel that drives whatever the outcome happens to be. I'll make the case that really data is the raw material from which you're building things. And as a result, if you're going to build something new, you got to get all the raw materials there. It's not that you can move them piecemeal. It's not that you can consume them as you need them. You need all of that material in the right place at the right time in order to get this to actually to achieve the ends that you're trying to head towards. And that means that you've got to fundamentally, you've got so many other specific drivers to ensure that you've actually got those full data sets wherever you need them, that now we're looking at really thinking about data in much different ways, and in ways in which start to deal with data at a higher level of abstraction. You need to really understand what that data is and work with it appropriately in order to get it to the places where you need it.
Yeah, exactly. And unfortunately, because of other factors in the economics and the physics of this, you also have to start thinking about what are the impacts of moving the data. In particular, a lot of the things that people complain about are egress charges that the public cloud vendors charge when you try to bring your data back or move it. The thing is, those vendors don't charge ingress charges. So when you start looking at these type of environments and how we're going to be running these workloads and how we're going to extract value out of the data, then you could start thinking about, okay, well, how does the licensing work? How does the cost work? What if we were just keeping a centralized repository and firing the data off to whatever cloud we needed to? There's no egress fee. That's all ingress. So from a writing perspective, that's low cost. You can do it. That's great. But what we need to start doing is, okay, now let's think about what the real workflow is now. Now the real workflow is I'm going to move my data to where it needs to be processed and get whatever value I need out of that, because they might have a new SaaS application or microservice or compliance thing or whatever value proposition that cloud or SaaS provider has. That's why I'm moving the data there. But where you're moving it there with the thought that I'm going to get that data processed and only bring back a small amount in terms of the results and the value I wanted to extract out of that data, and leave that data out there. Because I think the one thing that we have to remember about cloud storage, I think the superpower that we don't think about in cloud storage is not the expandability, it's the ability to make things go away. Because that's something you can't do with physical environments. So I think we need to start taking advantage of that more often. Move it there, get my processing done, make that data go away, and just send me back a relatively small portion so I don't get killed on egress charges. So if we start thinking about this, it's more complex. Obviously, it's not just I'm moving from A to B. It's got to be changes to the workflow. But unfortunately, those are the type of things that might be necessary because we don't get destroyed on egress charges and other things that could greatly blow up your total cost.
Well, and a lot of this is strategic thinking about data. And again, it's a shift in mindset because data for so long was the byproduct. You stuffed all the stuff into the database. You had all of the data that you created, but it was the application that was the focus. And, yes, you had to have the storage for the data but it was all the functionality was wrapped around the application itself. We are now standing that all on its head because the data is where all the value is. Pick whatever application you want to be able to use that data, but it's the data itself that is the valuable aspect of it. And as you're identifying, you got to build strategies that are going to help you effectively manage how you're working with it. And your example is a great one because it's the thing we talked about back in the early days of cloud, right? Which was cloud can be reasonably cost effective as long as you know how to turn things off. Which when we were on-prem, we didn't have to worry about it. Now, that wasn't always the case with data because, of course, on-prem, when you started running out of data, making step increments in adding data capacity was expensive. But the nice thing about cloud is you've got that other cost advantage, which, to your point, you can make it all go away really easily if you need to lower costs.
Yeah, and I think that is a great advantage, but I think people still, even with that, have challenges as well. Because if we look at some of what we're seeing, even if in terms of moving the data and whatnot, a lot of organizations have multiple copies of data. I think in the study we saw, on average, organizations had anywhere from 5 to 6 copies of data, and that's usually a price of doing business and something we have to think about in terms of. Of course, we're going to have a ransomware recovery copy. It's going to be immutable. We're also going to have maybe a test dev copy of data to do so-and-so. We might have a localization copy for our coworkers across the globe. So they're not going across the WAN just to access data we have here. So having multiple copies of data is a price of doing business. I think we have to do a better job of isolating and controlling which of these copies of data we'll have because those could potentially be security issues and can also be cost issues if we just leave them out there and nobody goes out and recovers that space when that data is no longer needed. Unfortunately, we do, with any innovation you wind up doing, you do see abuses of the innovation as well. Like we've seen cases where, hey, we were creating a new self-serve backup recovery tool. It's awesome. You could search, you could find, you could recover something really quickly. Well, guess what? In some cases, we've seen organizations, that new fancy tool is way easier to use than their search tools. Instead of searching, they would just say, well, why don't we just pull it from backup? They pull it from backup, they restore it, they do what they have to do, and then they forget to delete it. And now we've gone from 6 copy to 7.
Now you got one more copy.
Exactly.
And how many times have we gotten into a situation where we're we see multiple environments, we see sort of the duplicated data that gets left somewhere. And then we wind up getting stuck in terms of where that data is and the potential for exposure. We dumped that into a database, and then suddenly the database got exposed because we sort of forgot that database was there. It was a test database. Yeah.
There are numerous examples. Can't name names here, but yeah. It's not too hard to find those examples of people who did something in the cloud or did something somewhere else and just forgot about it and left that data out there, which is obviously going to be a huge potential for data loss or data leakage.
While we're talking about security and some of the aspects there, What about things you'd mentioned regulatory requirements, things like data sovereignty? Where do you see that heading?
Well, we continue to see. I mean, obviously, things are always changing in terms of the political environments and whatnot. But I think a lot of organizations, smart ones, are hedging their bets. They're trying to figure out what their long term plans are going to be, especially in some of the art environments that are more regulated. They have to figure out, well, are we going to go on prem there or go with a different provider? I think as they're starting to look at these different opportunities, we do see, especially when, as I was talking about with the egress charges, we did see a fairly large percentage of organizations say that as a result of these egress charges, we may go to another provider that has less egress charges or doesn't charge egress charges, as being one of their pivots to be able to get out of that situation and do these different things. So I think there's a lot of things in motion, but by and large, we'll continue to watch and monitor how different types of clouds or different providers might be preferred in terms of where they're going to hold their data longer term.
Well, when we start thinking about a lot of the regulatory pieces, I mean, the fundamental aspect of this is data security, and there are a lot of other broader drivers on the security side as well.
Yeah, from a resiliency and security perspective, there were a couple of key stats that popped out in terms of, again, how this is getting real, especially as we're dealing with larger payloads and larger potential migration jobs. We did have about 55% response agreeing that because of these types of factors, the potential for data loss and corruption uh, has become higher because of the vulnerability of doing the migration. Another thing that was interesting was 79% of the respondents were also concerned that the potential of security threats during a migration, as you have data at rest, data at flight, data going to your target, all of these different things were also a concern for organizations as well, especially as they're thinking about potential security threats there and what could happen as this data is in motion and being migrated. I think the other thing that other organizations are also worried about is extended unplanned downtime that could happen as a result of migration. We had about 67% response saying that they were afraid of that as well, especially as we're dealing with larger and larger data sets and migration jobs that could last potentially weeks at a time. Those type of things wind up being big concerns for organizations.
Well, because data doesn't stand still while the migration's taking place. And then you've got to resynchronize that data. You've got to be able to merge those various data sets and recover from where you were, and which is just as messy and risky as doing a full recovery. So yeah, that creates some challenges, especially as we start getting towards larger volumes. What do you see? One of the things that was interesting is that we're starting to see, when you start looking at these very large volumes, some constraints in terms of how you actually move that data. Uh, and that's something where, again, just moving it through network connections at smaller sizes maybe is manageable, but it's when you start moving petabytes at a shot, that, depending upon what the performance of your network environment is, that could present some challenges.
Yeah, for sure. I think the two biggest changes that we saw methodology wise, I'll talk about the network change in a second, but one of the biggest changes that I saw was who's actually responsible for doing these migrations. In the past, it was really very much the in-house technical staff was running those for the organizations. In the previous study a year ago, it was about 65% or so of respondents said that they did their last significant migration using in-house staff. The notable change is that's dropped to 48% in the most recent study. So looking at that, it's clear that organizations are realizing this might be a bigger problem than we can chew. Maybe we need to get some help. And help is coming in the form of service provider and system integrators. A year ago, it was about 24% of respondents used a service systems integrator or a service provider to help them with their migration jobs. That's jumped up to 46% in the most recent study. So clearly more and more organizations are looking for other alternatives to get some help because they know this problem is very crucial. And again, as we talked about, the potential security threats, potential data loss, potential for unplanned downtime, all those different things are justifying organizations going in and trying to get help. Looking at the methodology in terms of how people are moving, we've also seen a shift there as well. And in terms of the top category of how people want to move data, network transport still winds up being the leader. About 42% of respondents said that they did their migration over network transport last time, but that's dropped a little bit from 46% the previous year. I think the interesting area, though, is we've seen more and more usage of provider-enabled physical transports, such as like AWS Snowball and other type of provider external storage devices that are being shipped out to sites to move them back over a virtual sneakernet type environment. That's gone up from about 26% response previous year to 36% this year. We've also seen more organizations physically transporting their data in the form of tapes or arrays or other types of storage media to the provider. That's jumped up from 12% previous year to 20%. So again, as these workloads have gotten bigger and as people have wanted to move data faster, unfortunately, the physics of putting data on a plane is still faster than trying to drag it over a wire, speed of light or not. It's just in terms of dealing with these large data sets, people are looking at alternative mechanisms to move it because they just can't afford to spend so much time waiting for those migrations to occur.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to match the network throughput of a box full of drives that you've overnighted to your particular provider. That you can move a lot of data pretty quickly, and I guess especially when you start talking about some of these large scale environments, move a large box, maybe even a container full of storage capacity, and you can move it a whole lot more quickly than you can even over some of the fastest network connections.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think those are the type of changes that we're looking at. And likewise, when we look at these changes, if I'm a cloud provider or a vendor, clearly it's time to invest more into this area of data migration because, to me, I think data migration along with backup in those areas, you kind of think of them as kind of boring things, but I see them as almost like the most valuable piece of real estate within the environment because migration and backups and archiving, those tools, the value they have is they see all the data. All the data has to run through them to be able to function correctly. And if data is running through them, that's a great time for you to get metrics on what exactly is my data, why is my data important, and not only getting those metrics, but also getting a better idea of how you prioritize. A lot of people are talking about, hey, we should be doing metadata tagging on all this data. Well, it's a great time to be able to do that if the data is already running through your systems. So I think more and more as organizations start seeing this and as we start seeing more pressures to do a better job with the data management parts and do a better job of making this data accessible, I think we'll start seeing more of an emphasis towards why data migration should be a key asset or a key service and not just something that terrible chore that I have to do, like it's time to do spring cleaning on the garage or the attic. We don't want people to be thinking of it that way. We need to start thinking about it. How can we use this to deliver value?
Yeah, this isn't just get out the hand truck and start lugging tapes. This is a point at which you now have a strategic opportunity to use that data movement. If you're touching it, why not analyze it? And what's the biggest problem that we have with data? Because we see this on the application side, we see it on the security side. It's that classification is really hard. And traditionally, enterprises have done a really lousy job of classifying data and understanding what it is. As you're pointing out, being able to get metrics in terms of what really does that data look like, being able to generate metadata around it. And that's the point at which you look at all the data prep that's necessary for AI. Now you can do that because, hey, if you're touching the data, as you're pointing out, now's the opportunity to actually do the strategic thing and classify the data as you move it and simplify your life down the road and make your data that much more valuable, getting back to raising the level of abstraction of the content or the understanding of the content that's actually in that data.
Yeah, exactly. And if you're going to try to make a tangible case to your management as to why this matters, well, go back to them and say, hey, you may have just spent millions and millions of dollars on GPUs. Guess what? GPUs in your data center, well, that's like a Ferrari in the garage. If I can't find the keys and I can't use it, what's the point? You need data to be able to unlock that value. It doesn't matter how many GPUs you have. I mean, if you spend all that time to get the GPUs or all this processing power so that you can analyze the data, if you're waiting for that data to get there or you can't even find the data, you're not able to extract the real value that you've of these investments you've already made. So when I look at this, it's clear, might not be the most interesting topic or might not be a top of mind topic, but it's the thing that will prevent you from extracting the value out of your investments.
Well, it's hark back to Alex Johnston's data on the AI project success issue. Number one and basically tied for lead in terms of project failure reasons were budget and data quality. And here's a point where you have an opportunity to improve data quality at the same time as you're doing something that's going to be the necessary part of actually getting it to where you need it, but you can enhance it and improve it and tackle what is one of the thornier issues in terms of actually being able to get the data into the condition that it's needed to be useful.
Yeah, absolutely. Because if you're not using the right data, then what exactly are the results you're getting? Can you trust those results? What about hallucinations? What about all these other potential issues if you're not using the right data or if you're using outdated data? Yeah, that's the problem because you're counting on these systems and other things to help provide value and help direct you strategically. And making bad decisions with bad data is just never going to be the right way to do it.
Very much so. Good. Well, this has been great, Henry. Appreciate all the insights. But we are at time for this episode. But as always, so much more that we could be discussing. But thank you for being back. And I guess you get yet another shot on the Next in Tech tour jacket.
Thanks so much. And I'll be awaiting my participation badge.
Good stuff. Well, that is it for this episode of Next in Tech. Thanks to our audience for staying with us. And thanks to our production team, including Sophie Carr, Faran Miadashian, Kira Smith, and we say many thanks and good travels to Adam Kowalski on the marketing and events teams. Hope to join us for our next episode, where we're going to be talking about human resources technology, digging into an area where there's a little bit of AI, but also a whole lot of background in terms of being able to apply greater sophistication to how we're managing what we do day in, day out. I hope you'll join us then, because there is always something next in tech.